made you decide to go to college?
Well, I think for me, it was kind of instilled. My mother, she is a graduate of Tennessee State University. My father didn't have a high school diploma at all. But I think for them, right, like education was important. I think the broader challenge, and one of the broader challenges here in a lot of our schools, is that even when young people want to go to college and pursue college, they oftentimes don't have the opportunities to do so. To give you an example of what that looks like, I graduated from Morningside High School in Englewood, California.
Oh, yeah.
Right, we didn't have the same level of AP classes, our advanced placement classes, as a school on the West Side or as a Beverly Hills. You can take AP classes in 4 subjects at Morningside compared to taking classes in up to 15 subjects at a school like Quartz Hill in Lancaster. So while right, I think I definitely had the opportunity to go to college, and I'm proud of that. Right, I think oftentimes one of the broader issues, and one of the issues that we address, I think more specifically in the community organizing space, is that there isn't opportunity,
Oh, I see.
right, to get there. So my job is to help create that opportunity.
You were born and raised in Englewood, California?
In Englewood and other parts of Southern California,
Right.
And lived in Tennessee and Texas for a little bit. Yeah.
What was your neighborhood like in Englewood while growing up?
Well, I grew up in a place called the Bottoms. It's 104th and 10th Ave, right? It is, it was definitely, a neighborhood where there was gang activity, low income, had a high population of immigrants, Black and Latino immigrants, right? So we had high populations of Haitians, Belizeans, folks from Honduras, as well as folks from El Salvador, Mexico.
What a mess.
Yeah, and I mean, I wouldn't call it a mess, as well as, right, just regular Black folks, right? So it was, so I think growing up in a neighborhood like that, right, like oftentimes when people think about growing up in neighborhoods with gang activity, they're thinking like people are dodging bullets every day and, that there's violence. Yeah, there was violence, but I think there also too, right, was a very real sense of community. We had folks who were on our block who would call themselves gang members who would help my mom with groceries or who, would make sure that me and my friends got to school safe, right? Like,
Were you ever part of a gang?
No, not personally.
Did they try to force you to become a part?
No, again, right? Like they were the ones who actively told us not to do it,
I've seen
and to stay in school and keep playing basketball because gangs and hooping isn't our gangs and violence isn't the way, right? So again, I think there's a popular narrative that like in urban Black communities where there is gang violence that that it's all the way bad, and that's not necessarily the case.
You mentioned that white schools are better, more qualified or better equipped than the Black schools. Why don't the Black teachers and Black principals and school board, why don't they care enough about the Blacks to make sure that their schools are brought up in the same manner that the white schools are? Why don't they care enough about the Blacks to do that?
Well, I think this is the issue, right? Because at my school, I had some phenomenal educators, some phenomenal administrators who supported us. I mean, some of them were problematic, others were really good. So I think with that, the real issue isn't necessarily, right, like why don't they care enough? Because I think they do. I think the issue is resources. When we look at schools and school funding, for example, schools are funded by property taxes, right? And if everybody who lives in a particular area is a renter and they're not paying property taxes, then how are the schools going to get that additional funding to hire those teachers who are more qualified to then teach those AP courses? To give you another example of what that looks like, at my school in the 10th grade, we had a geometry teacher, or we didn't have a solid geometry teacher. So for 10th grade geometry, right, like we had 5 different teachers over the year and we stayed in chapter 1. So how are we supposed to perform well to get more performance-based funding from the federal government if we don't have consistent educators?
Is that a money issue or like a teacher doing the right thing issue?
Well, it's absolutely a money issue, right?
So you're saying that if the black teachers had more money, they would have done better in that class?
No, I'm saying that if the school districts had more money to hire and
Oh, I see.
retain the talent that they need to, right, then they would do it.
But
But oftentimes these school districts don't. As a
did you
matter
know
of
that they
fact,
do get the money, but the blacks misuse the money? The administration, the so-called leaders of the black community, they keep it for themselves rather than investing it into the school. Were you aware of that?
well, I mean, I think there is some truth to that, but I think it's a lot more complicated than that,
What do you mean?
right?
Either you're
Like,
stealing the money or you're not.
well,
It
it's,
can't
it's
get any simpler than that.
Well, no, it's not necessarily that simple. Some parts of it are fiscal mismanagement. Other parts of it, right, are not having the not having the fiscal resources at all, right? So, to giving you an example of what that looks like, in the city of Englewood, I was a part of an organization called the Social Justice Learning Institute.
Social justice learning?
Social Justice Learning
Okay.
Institute. And in 2012, we worked on a bond measure called Measure GG to bring $90 million to Englewood schools, right? And so essentially that raised property taxes so that way we were able to then invest money into rebuilding schools, right? Schools were literally falling apart.
Yes.
Now, since that time, right, a number of schools, elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools have been repainted, have been rebuilt. There's been infrastructure placed in those. So again, right, like the issue wasn't necessarily that that Englewood Unified didn't have the money. The
Right.
issue was that or not didn't have it, but like the issue wasn't that Englewood Unified didn't want to do it. The issue was that Englewood Unified didn't have the capital to make it happen.
But if
So,
you notice, they still, even though they paint the building, the teachers are still not teaching the children.
well, again, right, like I think this is a broader, challenge and a broader structural issue with education, right? Like some folks in schools, some folks in other places, right? Like I think one of the challenges with ed is that a lot of times in schools or a lot of times in places you have to teach to test. And that style of education is just problematic, right? Like, because it's performance driven and not really driven in the kids having a strong concept of the material. So a lot of community-based organizations,
A lot of parents tell me
folks have
that
been trying to change that.
a lot of teachers tell me they can't teach the black kids because the black kids are so out of order. They can't contain them or control them because they're like acting out in classes. They're threatening the teachers. They won't respect the adults. How do you deal with that kind of stuff?
Well, I think for one, right, like I think that's highly problematic. To give you an example, I, as a community-based educator, while I was working with SJLI, and now in my new position as the manager of the Brother Son Selves Coalition, we work with young people who have been pushed out of schools. We had worked with young people who were literally incarcerated in juvenile hall, right? And we were able to manage our classrooms and stuff just fine. I think oftentimes there's an underlying assumption that people walk into in those classrooms that these kids can't learn, so I'm going to treat them as that. But if you don't walk in with that assumption and you walk in with something like our friends from Californians for Justice would call a relationship-centered approach, right, then it's much more easier to engage young people and to teach them, right? Like, but the issue is that when you have educators, when you have adults specifically who don't necessarily want to invest and don't want to build relationships with young people because you don't care about them or you don't like them, then that becomes the problem.
Is that a
and
problem?
Kids are going to respond.
Is that a problem? A lot of the black teachers, they don't feel like dealing with those kind of kids.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't even just say that's a black teacher thing. I think that's a broader.
But that's who mostly complain about the black kids are the black teachers.
No,
And
I would
especially
say
the black
that's
female teachers.
I would say that's a teacher thing. I would say that's a broader, because again, right, like if we look at, for example, if we look at some of the data on school suspensions, right, like the data on school suspensions would suggest that that the majority of people being suspended are black kids, particularly black boys.
Right.
Right. But oftentimes black boys are suspended for violations that other kids might get detention for, other kids might just get sent out the classroom for. So again, this isn't just all black teachers doing that, because if so, it would be really low because the vast majority of America's teaching force is still white and female. right?
But the black boys, not all, but most, tend to fight in class, fight the teacher, curse the teachers out, rude in the classrooms, and so they will get thrown out. Whereas the white kids tend to be more respectful in the classroom. They don't curse and fight and carry on like that. How should the teachers deal with the black kids acting that way?
Well, I mean, I think the issue, right, is that, you know, if you frame it as that, you would think that it's only a black kid problem. I've certainly been in spaces where, you know, where white kids would act the same exact way, but black kids are criminalized for doing the same things that white kids get therapy for, right?
So how should the teacher deal with the
but
black kids acting that way?
But well, I think the issue is it's not how should the teachers deal with the black kids acting that way. The issue is, well, what's the underlying problem, right? What's the underlying problem with these issues, and then how do we address the underlying problem?
And what is the underlying problem?
Well, oftentimes the underlying problems are a lot of the things that young people walk into classes with. Young people walk into classes, you know, addressing trauma at home, addressing things that happen outside of the class, addressing things that may be going on with their peers. And again, right, like at a school like, let's say, for example, a Phillips Exeter Academy, which is, you know, a private boarding school on the East Coast, like 60% of their alum go to Ivy League colleges, right? Like those kids have more drugs, those kids have more things than any of the kids in our neighborhoods do. But the issue is that when they're going through stuff, they are giving resources and tools to succeed, as opposed to being over-criminalized and penalized for it.
So that school you mentioned, is it a white school?
Well, it's a private elite school.
Is it white?
I mean, they have a white population, but it's...
Is it majority white? I've not heard of it, that's what I'm asking. Is it majority white or something?
I mean, well, the majority of a lot of these boarding schools, not only are they majority white, but they're also majority wealthy, right? So even if they are racially diverse, right, the average income bracket, right, like these are folks that the 1% where they would send their kids to.
But the school you just mentioned, is that a predominantly white school back east?
One of them, yeah.
Okay.